Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. You are actually quite a daunting audience to speak to on the basis that I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a practicing member of the parole board, and I've never in fact actually worked in prisons, so I feel I start at a bit of a disadvantage. In some of the jobs you referred to that I've had in the past, there was a sort of criteria about independence for doing them. And in my case, I think they mistook complete ignorance for independence. And I got the job on the basis I knew nothing at all about what I was talking about. But I'll try and do a bit better today. I'm going to say a bit about the parole board. I'm sure most of you know very well how the parole board operates, but for those that don't, I'll just say a few things. And in particular, I want to touch on some of the ways in which the parole board works with psychologists, which I think, or doesn't, as the case may be, which I think would be interesting to do. And of course, I planned mainly when I came to do this talk to talk about the IPP sentence, which I do think is a stain on the justice system. I do think there's some cruelty in it. But since but I also want to say perhaps more than I'd originally intended about the environment in which the IPP sentence is served, about what's happening in prisons now, both at a sort of policy and political level, but also perhaps the day-to-day living conditions. Because I think, as you know, there's a new Justice Secretary only just started. And so while I think some of the problems in the prison system will be known to you, I think at this particular time it's worth restating them so there can be no doubt about the challenges ahead. I should say I'm going to draw a bit on my experience as Chief Inspector of Prisons. And I realized after a while when I did that job, which I stopped a kind of year ago now, it gives you a very unique insight into what's happening in the prison system. So I don't argue a better or deeper insight than other people. You wouldn't have the same insight as prisoners themselves have, or people who've worked in prisons for years. But in the time I was Chief Inspector, I realized after a while, nobody else was doing quite what I was doing, going to as many prisons right across the country of all types and spending enough time in them, each of them, to get a bit under the skin. And I certainly think that gave me a view of kind of what was happening that was different to the view that other people were able to get. As I say, not better, but certainly from a different angle. And I'm going to use that a bit. And I became, my first engagement with the parole board was the parole board has what it called a review committee, which is a committee with some independent members that reviews cases where we've released someone and they've gone on to commit a serious further offence. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And as Chief Inspector of Prisons, I was one of the independent members on the review committee. And after a while, it became kind of clear to me that some of the people, when they'd made those decisions, hadn't really understood what prisons were like and what was happening in prisons. But it was also clear to me that offender manager units and that side of prison life didn't really understand what the parole board was kind of looking for. And so I thought there was maybe an opportunity to try and bridge some of that a gap. And again, that's a theme maybe I'll pick up talking to you now. So maybe to say something about the parole system, first of all, and as I said, I'm sure a lot of you can have a little doze now because you'll know some of this. But if you ask people outside the very small world that we all inhabit about what parole is, if you Google parole, people will come up with very different answers, right? It seems to me either you get a lot of stuff around forgiveness, and sort of mercy. You've done long enough now somehow to expiate your crime and you can be forgiven. And a lot of the American system, I think, works on that kind of basis. Alternatively, I think what a lot of people think, and certainly what I thought before I got involved in this, it was that you sort of earned parole by your good behavior. It was about what you did, you deserved parole. And actually, it seems much more to me to be about now, not so much what you, the prisoner, do, but what the system does to you. And I think there is an element that sort of provided you can keep your nose clean, you can go to the right courses, say the right sort of things, then you stand a pretty good chance. But if, for instance, those courses aren't provided where you are because you've been put in the wrong place, or if the day-to-day realities of prison life make keeping your nose clean pretty impossible, then you won't. But I'm not sure, I'm disquieted by how little it seems to me to do with you, the prisoner's individual behaviour, attitudes, actions. And I think there's a sort of ethical gap there. So, there are Parole Board's an independent body that works in the criminal justice system with its criminal justice agencies to protect the public by risk assessing prisoners to decide whether they can be safely released into the community. I think one of the important things to say about that, this is not what I wrote, this is something I inherited, but I accept this. And sometimes people think that our job is to get prisoners quickly through the parole system. Actually, that's not our job. Our job is to protect the public and make sure people who shouldn't be released don't get released. That's how the role is kind of framed. And I think that's a reasonable thing for the citizen to expect the state to do. And so that would be my kind of starting point. But we'll say a bit more about risk assessment in a moment. But I've also got a problem about our, as Itio was saying yesterday, about our reliance on kind of risk assessment as a model and the very precise formulations people make about risk. I think I'd have some queries about. Just to say something a bit about the Parole Board kind of now. I won't go through all of that, been going 50 years. Just two things I think are kind of worth noting. One is I think people generally are surprised by the volume of cases we deal with. So last year, well over 7,000 oral hearings, going on for 17,000 cases dealt with on the papers. And we just recruited 104 new members. So out of 250 or so, 100 have started in the last 6 months. And that will have a big, and I think relatively unpredictable impact on the culture and the way the Parole Board actually kind of works. And we were doing a training session for the new members last week. And the new members were asking the old members, why things were done in a particular way, and pretty much the answer was that's the way it's always been done. Well, I suspect some of that will change with the impetus and momentum that those new members create. And you'll be aware of we are so decision-making powers. Important to emphasise, I think, that we are deciding whether, for the most part, whether people get released. It's not an advisory function. Parole Board's a court-like body. And certainly, I think sometimes people do forget that. They think it's just another sentence planning meeting and they kind of turn up, or they don't turn up, as the case may be. Well, it's a court, you have to turn up. And then this is the test that we apply when considering the release of prisoners who come before it. The board is required to determine whether it is satisfied that it is no longer necessary for the protection of the public that the prisoner should remain detained. And I, particularly in relation to IPPs, how does a prisoner persuade you of that? And indeed, how do you assess it? I see sometimes, you'll see some OASIS score, and someone will have a OASIS score about risk within 1 percentage point. So within that can't be, the system can't be that accurate. Can it? And I think sometimes when people describe how the system works, there's a kind of medicalization narrative that we can precisely diagnose what's wrong with you, and then we will apply these treatments that will fix you. And there's a sort of, and I think, again, as Itiel was saying yesterday, there's a kind of comfort in it being a science, because it takes away our responsibility for the decision. If it's simply reduced to an arithmetical equation, we can add up all these factors, come to a score, we can apply this, that reduces the score, then we can release you. It kind of takes away our responsibility for the decision. And I think sometimes people will clutch the psychologist's report is to give us that sort of shield and certainty, and I don't believe it. I don't believe it is a mathematical equation like that. I don't think you can absolve yourself of the necessity to make human judgments. This is how the system's changed over the last kind of decade. These are the number of oral hearings which you see sweeping up, a 450% increase between 2005 and 2017. Had I thought of it and technically literate, I would have done another line going the other direction, which shows the decrease in resources and parole board members. And the conclusion of those two things is this. This is where the Osborne judgment kicked in, which required us to hold more hearings, more oral hearings. And you can see there immediately there's an impact on on our backlog. So it was around 1,200 kind of cases in the system, went up to a height of nearly 3,500. Is actually the trend now is pretty much down, and we think we'll get it down to about 1,200, the backlog back to where we started by the end of this year. But the consequence of that, I think it's important to understand the consequence of that. That isn't a sort of, it's not just data, right? That's people staying in prison months or years longer than they need to, not because of what they've done, but because of administrative delays in the system. Last year, we shelled out almost £1 million in compensation for prisoners who, by the time they were released, it was determined if the hearing had been had on time, they would have been released kind of earlier. And I think it is unacceptable. It is completely unacceptable that people are remaining in prison, not because of what they've done, but because of administrative inefficiency, I think. And so actually, boringly enough, a lot of our effort is focused on trying to get those blue bars to be shorter. But at the same time, we need to do that in a way that doesn't increase the risk of serious further offences. You can look at this. These are the blue lines are the number of release or open decisions, and the yellow bars, which you can't see, are the numbers of serious further offences that are reported to our review committee. And I think depending on the audience, I'll just show you another slide just to kind of do that. This is another way of looking at it. This shows a bit when those serious offences occurred. So in between 2013 to 2016, in total, there were about 23 serious further offences a year, average about 23 a year. No, 23 in total, no more than that, sorry. In the first 3 months after someone had been released, someone went on to commit a serious kind of further offence. So that's, we were pretty confident it was okay to let them go, and within 3 months, 25 of them committed a serious further offence. Go back to this slide. I think depending on the audience, people would read this in different ways. I think if you looked at that figure for 2016, we released or sent to open 3,800 people, 22 of whom were then, in that year, committed a serious further offence. And I think for some people would say, that's a fraction of 1%. That's an indication that you are being too risk averse. I think for other people, the headline would be 22 people that the Pro Board let out went out and committed murder, rape, and serious violence. What on earth were they thinking of? Pays your money, you take your choice. But I would say, I think that somehow, not in this audience, sometimes when I talk to prison reform groups about their system, they never talk about these smaller figures and what that actually means. And I think if we don't talk about the harm that potentially that people have done before they come into prison, what they might do if we get this kind of wrong, then we're just not convincing that we are to a wider audience. And I think we have to show that that isn't just an afterthought, but is actually central to how we address this kind of issue. What's happening going ahead? We've got the backlog coming down. About a third of the big issue, about a third of our cases involve recalls. The recall graph is shooting up, and I think myself that the barrier for making a recall is too low, and the barrier for re-releasing is too high. Number of IPPs has fallen significantly, but still 3,500 not yet released. And 34% of the cases we deal with are not heard on the day we expect. They're deferred or adjourned, which again I think is an unacceptable figure. So there's still major failings in the system. I won't go through this. Some strategic priorities that we're trying to deal with some of these things. And I want to talk a bit about how we might work with you to resolve some of these issues. Just briefly touch on this and do a bit of an advert, I suppose. I have to say I didn't, before I started working in the Prisons Inspectorate, I would have been one of those people who got psychiatrists and psychologists confused, actually, and I know that's a really annoying thing to say, but I confess it now, and knew very little about it. And my first, and of course, actually, when we did inspections, we didn't often see those sort of interactions that people, psychologists, had with prisoners, because that wasn't, it wouldn't work if you were intruding on it. And the first time I really saw that, and I'll just tell you because, I saw a lot of stuff when I was Chief Inspector of Prisons, and some of it, I think now back to what are the things that stick in my mind, what are the pictures that stick. And one of the pictures that sticks was in, we were doing inspections of Low Newton, which is a women's prison up in the northeast. Where I remember one of the startling things about that is more than half the women there were having some kind of mental health treatment. It was more like a hospital than a prison. But within that, they had the Primrose Unit. I don't know if anybody here works on the Primrose Unit for women with some of the most, the women that would be the most tabloid headline makers. They're the women who've done some of the most terrible kind of offences that for all sorts of complicated reasons, I think, particularly when women commit them, create horror or whatever. And there was a team of psychologists working. I remember I barged in really to one of their team meetings, and they let me sit in on it. And I wrote, and we wrote this about it, which we published. In some cases, the mix of professionalism and compassion I witnessed being delivered to some very troubled women was very moving. And it was moving to see the work that your colleagues in the profession was doing in that situation, the mix of professionalism and compassion. And I know that's replicated in in your day-to-day work all over the shop. And I wanted to make the point, we acknowledged and saw that, and that's one of that meeting of those professionals was one of the memories that sticks with me in my time as Chief Inspector, but because of that. We have in Pro Board psychologist members. We used to have 12. We've just recruited another 20. A minimum commitment of only 35 days a year, so not a big commitment should you want to come and join us. We're doing a next round of recruitment in 2018, and we hope some of you will think about applying. There's more than, I know Sue Vivian Byrne is here, but there's some other Pro Board member psychologists here, and if you are interested, do kind of talk to them, because we do hope more people will think about becoming a Pro Board member. That's the commercial. I did a little bit of a talk with some members before I came out about what I should say, both to psychologist members and others, about what I should say to you. And I'm not sure about whether these are valid things, but they said, look, need to have a better understanding of what we each want and can provide to each other. There was a view from some Pro Board members that psychologists' reports don't focus sufficiently on risk. That's what they said. And a lot of stuff around delays. Give an example of a case I was in the other day, where sitting in the other day, to remember where the Pro Board had directed a psychologist to produce a report with plenty of notice. I think about 4 months or whatever. Then after about 3 months, 2 months, whatever it was, psychologist comes back and said, look, we can't do that. We don't think it's the right thing to do. We want to do something else. That got looked at by the Pro Board again, and they said, no, we want you to do what we originally asked for, by which time it was too late to do it, and the hearing had to be deferred. Now, I'm not saying on that, I certainly don't mean to imply whose fault that is. I've no idea what the rights or wrongs of it were, but we've got to be doing between us better than that. If, in a sense, because we can't agree or we get into a muddle, people's cases are put back and they're spending longer in prison than they need to do, we need to sort that out. And I hope one of the things that will arise from me being here today is perhaps we can actually have some more, we can work on that a bit, so our understandings of each other, you as professionals, us as a Pro Board, about what we need from each other, can be sort of clearer, so that we ourselves, between us, are not contributing to the delays and hold-ups in the system. And I'd hope that that is something at least that maybe we could work on kind of going forward. And I think there's also some real doubts now about, people very concerned about RM2000, about how effective that is. I'm real confused about what's happening to sex offender treatment programs, their replacement now. Anybody knows the answer to that, be pleased to hear it. I think that's, and that goes back to the, if they've scrapped sex offender treatment programs, well, what does that mean about all of those people who've waited to have a sex offender treatment go on a sex offender treatment program, or we've released because they have done a sex offender treatment program? And if they're now saying sex offender treatment programs aren't useful or valid, what about all the other programs we put people on? Are they right or wrong about that? And it goes back to, again, maybe what I was saying yesterday, we can be making very careful assessments based on the evidence kind of before us. But if that evidence is faulty, then so will our assessment be. So what else do we rely on that doesn't stand up? And this is, I just think it's quite interesting. This is some research that one of our Pro Board psychologists has done, Jo Schindler, and she just did some stuff up with Pro Board members about what they want from psychologists. I think there's slightly, I won't go through the whole slides because I think they're going to be distributed, that Pro Board members value and respect psychological knowledge, value the depth of understanding and analysis you provide, want clarity and direction, want an open and professional discussion at a hearing, and a concern with kind of independence of assessors. And I wonder really about whether actually they are, part of what we should talk about is whether those are reasonable expectations to have. And I think, again, I suspect there's something about wanting to relieve some of the burden of the decision. That's what they may look to you for, and perhaps that's not a reasonable thing. So that's probably enough about the Pro Board. I want to say more now about the kind of prison policy and institutional context. So these are, you'll know some of this, prison population stuff. Prison population on the 9th of June, latest figures, 85,367. Operational capacity, upper limit, 86,730. That meant the system was about 99% full. Right? And I think there's a real, so one of my messages for the new Secretary of State would be about prison overcrowding. Right? And the point is, when you're operating at 99% full, what that means is you have to put prisoners where there's space, not where you need them to be. And so it takes out that kind of, both within an individual prison and within the system as a whole. I remember going to Wandsworth once, talking to the people on reception in Wandsworth, which I think had a reception, which has a throughput, a churn of thousands of men a month, certainly. And they were saying they run out of space, so they were having to put smokers and non-smokers in the same cell. And then at the same time, this thing had come through from somewhere saying how people on reception should be on reception trying to identify prisoners who are in extremist risk. And they were saying, look, we can't even separate the smokers and the non-smokers, and you're expecting us somehow to have done this analysis and found this guy. You've got to be joking. So as long as you're operating at that kind of level. And overcrowding isn't simply a matter of lots of people being squished into, two men being squished into a cell that Victorians designed for one, bad though that is, and I'll say a bit more about that. It's also a question of you haven't got the space on the programs you need to run. There isn't space in the workshop that they want to go on. There isn't the staff to get them out of their cells on a reasonable kind of basis. So as long as you're operating at that level, you've got a huge problem. That's just, the first point is just about operational capacity. If you look at overcrowding in terms of the CSA thing, it's to be about 56% of the prisons that HMI went to 2015-16. And on top of all of that, you've had, although new staff are being recruited, a very big reduction in staff, and in particular, a big reduction in experienced staff. And look, this is people will know this, and it's being referred to a bit during this conference. But I think the prison, I think it's really important that nobody gets used to these figures and that they understand kind of what it means. So first of all, the deaths in custody. This is, I'll just go through them. So these are the most recent prison safety stats. So first of all, you just look at, some of those are the ones that get the headlines. Over 100 self-inflicted deaths, up 11% on the year before. So one every 3 days, about. The levels of, just look at assaults on staff, and up 38%, serious assaults on staff up 26% in a year, right? In a year, those figures, right? But the most shocking figure of all, which doesn't get enough attention, is this top one, about 340 deaths of all sorts in prison custody, up 20% on the year, right? So that can't be, of course the prison population is getting older, but you can't explain a 20% increase in the death rate. The population hasn't got that much older in that amount of time. If you were to do a comparison of deaths per 1,000, in 2010, when I became Chief Inspector of Prisons, the death rate per 1,000 was about 2.14. Right, just over 2. This year, the death rate per 1,000 was 4. So 4 per 1,000. Or one in every 250 prisoners died. The figure practically doubled in the course of 7 years. Right? And the only explanation for that, if you come up with a better explanation than this, tell me, is that conditions have deteriorated so much, it's killing people off. And if you look at the figures around kind of violence and self-harm, quite apart from what's going on individually with all of those, that's a picture of loss of control. Right? What that means is the dynamic and procedural and physical security is breaking down. People simply couldn't commit that level of violence if actually there were enough staff there and people knew what was going on. You can only do that because of a loss of control. Right? And these are not merely the kind of worst figures ever, that since the records began, they're getting worse still. We haven't peaked yet. And you won't sort anything else out until you sort this out. And then if you look at these levels of violence, what does it do to people's behavior? So when you're we were talking earlier about prisoner survival strategies in one of the workshops. Some of this is about physical survival. Survival is the right word. It is about survival, right? And what do you need to do? And I think we all sometimes underestimate the risk that prisoners are carrying. I'll tell you one of the things I think was, I think this was Risley. This was a catapult they found outside the prison that was being used to catapult in shed loads of, rucksack loads of what then were legal highs. They're now illegal highs, so spice and amber and all of that kind of stuff. And there's no doubt I think that's had an effect on the levels of kind of violence. I remember being at one prison, it was Guy's Marsh actually a few years ago, and essentially what was happening there with the delivery of drugs, it was very organised. Right? And one of the things about legal highs is the difference between the street price and the prison price is about 10 times. Whereas for an opiate, the difference between the street price and the prison price is about 3 times. But the unit cost of a legal high is quite low. Right? So if you want to make money out of it, you have to get a lot of the stuff in. Right? But it's relatively risk-free because it's difficult to detect and until recently wasn't illegal. So, but in order to get the stuff in bulk, you need to be organised. And what was happening at Guy's Marsh is it was very organised, the supply. A lot of guys there were self-isolating, weren't coming out of their cells to avoid getting to debt. But the way they were operating is they would pressure more vulnerable prisoners till a point that they asked for a transfer to a different wing. When they got into a different wing, they were then a supply node, right? Because then they'd go into education or whatever, where they'd meet the next chain in the supply, they were given the stuff, and then when they went back to their new wing, they therefore had to supply it. Right? And the debts weren't being enforced and collected inside the prison, they were being collected from prisoners' families who were outside. So you'd track down people who were coming to visit, and then you'd say, look, if you want little Johnny to keep his lovely good looks, you have to shell up. Right? And that's how it was operating, on a really big scale, and I think at that time the staff had just kind of given up about what was happening. Right? So if you're writing a report on someone doing that, what's their survival? You know, what would be a reasonable and rational strategy for them to take? I'd go along with what was being asked of me. I think probably I wouldn't want to get duffed up, or worse, I'd want to keep my family safe. I would be strongly suspecting that there was some prison staff collusion with what was going on. Whether I was correct in that or not, I wouldn't know, but I certainly wouldn't trust people to go and tell them what was happening to me. So all of that then, and I think like, so so that whole business of survival, all of those behaviours that are driven by that level of violence, then it gets caught up gets assessed by us. And I sometimes see stuff and I think, well, actually, I think what he's doing is entirely reasonable. There's a guy who was in Aylesbury, I didn't hear him the other day, and he put it to me like this. He said he was in a gang, known to be a gang member. He said, look, if a guy comes up to me and disses me, and I ignore him, then someone else will come up and do it a bit more. And if I ignore him, the third guy will come up and do me. So unless I give giving this first guy a bit of a slap saves everybody a lot of trouble. And we tried to sort of say why that wasn't a sensible strategy. Maybe it was. Maybe it was. Yeah. There we are. This is a prism. This Hull, I think. You're familiar with that. One of the delights of being chair of the Pro Board, this is a secret, so you mustn't tell anybody this, right? Okay. Well, there's every so often you get a telephone call from an outraged Pro Board member, normally one of our more senior members, who will have been kept waiting at reception, right? And they won't have been treated with the dignity to which they think their office requires. And I'm sure you've all been there. You've had someone dozing on reception, they don't know who you are, they're not expecting you, they won't let you in, etc., etc. And it's very annoying. And then you start to dig and say, that come right, and you find out what's happening. And you realise that his honour probably lost his temper and wasn't terribly polite to the staff on the gate either, and that may not have helped move things along, right? And we've, but that's a secret, right? So, right? And I said, well, look, imagine then that you're a prisoner, and every day of your life, you have to go through, to get from A to B, you have to go through 16 gates where there's someone a bit stroppy who may not be very interested. If you look at this, I worked it out. Let's say you're on, I don't know whether you can, let me just get, I know what I want this, right? Let's say you're there, I don't know if you can see the dot, but suppose you're sort of down on a cell here, and you've got to get up here somewhere. How many gates would you have to go through? Well, you'd have to come out of your cell. You'd probably have to go through a gate that would be locked at the bottom of the stairs. Then when you went into the central rotunda, there'd be another gate there. You go across the rotunda, another gate there, probably a gate then onto the wing, maybe a gate halfway along here, gate at the end there, gate into that little passageway, gate there, gate into wherever you're trying to get to. I tell students at Royal Holloway, so when you first go into prison, count the number of gates you have to go through to get to where you're going. Right? And imagine there's someone difficult and a bit stroppy on each of those gates. And if you do lose it once with someone who's not being helpful to you, then that will get written down. You'll get a nicking. It'll get written down. And then that will stay with you for years and years. And the pro board and you, psychologists, still got anger issues, we see. And so I think Ben Crew writes a great paper, I think, called Revisiting the Pains of Imprisonment. And he talks about, so it's a new version of the pains of imprisonment. He talks about the pains of psychological assessment. And one of the things he talks about is how that one moment of loss of temper or whatever then stays with you and gets analysed and written up and repeated for years, potentially. Right? And the frustrations of not knowing how all of that's going to kind of work. So what do you learn when you're going about your business in the prison? You learn not to show initiative or be in a hurry. Right? There's no point. You're a bit late for your appointment. No point hurrying because you've got to get stopped and let through the door. You learn not to make eye contact because that's a safe way of doing it. You learn not to be trusting with people and be suspicious. It's a pretty good survival strategy. All of those things, that's not very pro-social. Right? All of those things you learn, and it certainly doesn't quit you for your job afterwards. So all of that, how that impacts. And then there you are, finally, in your prison. So I do this picture, which reminds you that because not very many people about. And I'm going to talk about prison cells. I had this is another secret you mustn't repeat, right? I did when a certain Secretary of State called Chris Grayling was around, and I used to see him regularly, and I would send him a little note of things I thought we should talk about. And I always said, look, if the stuff you want to talk to me about, then kind of let me know in advance so I can prepare. And normally my list would have a few prison inspections that we'd done I thought I ought to tell him about. And then he'd always pick other ones randomly to ask me about. So I went to see him, and he said, I want to talk to you about your inspection of Wood Hill recently. So I said, well, that wasn't one of the ones I did. And he says, well, you said that the purposeful activity was poor. When I went there, I thought I went into workshops and were dating very good quality to me. So I said, well, I said, I wasn't there. Guess what happened is the problem was about most people weren't doing any activity. So what there was might have been good, but very few people doing it. And he says, well, I went onto the wings and I didn't see anybody about. So I said, well, that's because they were locked in their cells. He said they weren't. And then, like I was there with another senior official, and he turned to him and said, they weren't locked in their cells, were they? And he goes, well, actually, Secretary of State, they probably were. That is what kind of happens. Anyhow, so that's a sort of, this is I want to say a word about this. this is from what prisoners tell about how long they spend locked in their cell, right? Because I think if you want to understand prisons, you need to understand cells. That's where prisoners spend most of their time. Even in a pretty good prison, you would spend half your waking life in your cell, probably more. So if you looked at, so the first column is prisoners who told us the percentage, prisoners who told us they spent more than 10 hours out of their cell on a weekday. So leaving aside 61% in open prisons, but in all other categories of prison, no one's saying, no more than 20% saying that. The column on the right is people who told us they spent less than 2 hours out of their cell. In local prisons, 31%, young adult prisons, 38%. So they're banged up 22 hours a day. And so actually understanding, you need to understand people's behaviour in their cells. You need to understand what that's how their behaviour is. Where is it being acted out? It's in their cells. There's a great thing by a blog called Prison UK, which I think is quite, he does good stuff actually about prison life. Sometimes he does a rant about policy things and he's not so good. But when he's talking about prison life, I think he's pretty good. And he talks here about a day in a cell. What do you do in that 22 hours? Sleep, lie in bed, lie on the bed, get off the bed, make the bed, roll a cigarette, smoke a cigarette, get dressed, eat breakfast, make a cup of tea, wash up the bowl, wash up the mug, urinate, defecate, wash in the sink, shave, etc., etc. At the end of the day, get undressed, get into bed, masturbate, optional, try to sleep again, despite the screaming and shouting around you. That's about it, right? Day after day. Right? And to which I would add, be unbelievably bored. Right? I think one of the things that people don't give enough attention to is just how boring prison life is. Right? And then what else do you do? Well, it's fantastic. Actually, when researchers come around, it's fantastic because at least you've got something to do. You can fill in their form. People are always surprised by how much they do that. You can make a complaint. You can prepare for your court and parole. You can obsess about your psychological assessment. Maybe you could do some study of crafts. And you can test the system a bit, I think. That's what people do. They can test the system. Anything to keep your mind active. But also you do lots of negative things. You boo-hooch, you get off your head, you assault someone, you get assaulted, you fret about your report, you self-harm, you have sex. Plus, people, well, I think people have more sex than is understood. You worry and you reach boiling point. Right? As you would, wouldn't you? As you're stuck there. This is how I think most people think of cells. This picture only works for people of a certain generation. So like, this was a 1970s sort of comedy called Porridge, which some people will remember. And I think it's for a lot of people, it's their memory of prison. Right? And the story, the comedy is around. There's Fletch, who's the old lag at the top. Godbar, who's the sort of more naive cell padmate he's got. And the comedy is around their interaction with the strict Mr. Mackay, the prison officer there, and the rather hapless other prison officer called Mr. Barclough. And essentially, the prison officers and Fletcher and Godbar are trying, the comedy is around as they try to outwit each other. So what do you notice about that picture? Well, the first thing is the cell is enormous. And the second thing is there's a prison officer there who's got time to stop and have a chat with the prisoners. Right? I don't think you'd see either of those things. Now, this is from a NOMS or it's a promo of what a prison cell actually looks like. This is the outside of Lewis, and this is the inside of a Lewis prison cell. I think you can probably just see it, the lighting's very good. But how big is it? It's probably just about half the size of this stage, I would say. So width-wise, a bit wider than my outstretched arms are maybe twice as long. There's what you see, there's two bunks on the left. And what they were doing there is, and the television is on this color, there's a flat screen television on this wall. And so the guy in the bottom bunk couldn't see the television from the bottom bunk, so they'd hang hammocks from the top, they'd make a kind of hammock thing and hang it from the top bunk so they could watch the telly. On the wall, there's a toilet there, no storage space, one chair, and you're spending 22 hours there. This is slightly more lived-in cell. Again, I got used to get a bit obsessed by toilets when I was chief inspector. There's toilets behind there, kind of sink. You can't see it. What's rather touching is the guy on the top has got a picture of his family. Can't see on this picture. The guy on the bottom's got his prawn up beside his bed. This one's got a toilet off to the kind of side. Oh yeah, no, this is a flat double. This was in, I can't remember which prison this was now, but this was on an induction wing in a prison. And it had two old guys in there who couldn't manage the other cells because he couldn't manage the bunks. So they kept them on the induction wing where there were these, it was a flat double, right? So it didn't need a bunk. But the problem was they weren't being inducted anymore. So they had to spend their entire time banged up in this cell. So they were doing about 23 hours a day, locked up, and they'd been like that for months. And it's a Victorian cell designed for one. I'll do this one just to show, the point about this is the toilet. I don't apologize for going for a toilet. There's the bed and there's the toilet, and it's a double, right? So just think how humiliating that is, right? If you had any human dignity left, that would be stripped away from you, that, wouldn't it? Your most personal moments, public. This is a cell that we were told was ready for new arrivals in Pentonville. So that's that. That's the toilet. That's a bed with blood on it. And the first week we went in there, so the inspectors went over 2 weeks, and we went into the cell and we came out. We said, look, the officer said, look, there's blood on the bunk. I said, oh, good, thanks for telling us. Went back a week later, and it was still there. And Pentonville at that time had a rat problem. And this, you may not be able to see this very well. This, I think it's a really sad picture, this. This is, we were talking about people's kind of timetable. How we do it for time. This is a guy stuck this wall chart on his wall. And he marked on it everything that was important to him. So you can see, like there, that says trial. That says birthday, and that says trial again. And the rest is completely empty. So he'd gone to all of that trouble to get a calendar with the big things in his life and stick it up on the wall. And there was nothing to put on there. And so what does that do to people's behavior? How do you manage kind of that? And I think, and I think people will, but one thing you'll do is you'll muck about, really, won't you? You have to do something to get your brain going, I think. Or you sleep. Maybe you try and sleep your way through it. Maybe you take something to help you sleep your way kind of through it. But you need to survive this as much as you need to survive the violence on the wings when you're out. I'll just flick through a couple. This is just to show you, these are slightly better cells from open prisons. This one is worth noticing because it's quite a decent cell. He's made it a bit, he's personalized it there. One of the things about all the other pictures I showed you, randomly I noticed, there's no other colors in those other pictures. There's blue, orange, and green. No other color, no patterns at all. And I think that the sort of actual environment probably has an effect. Anyway, I'll just show you this because I want to be, actually you can do it better. These are more reasonable, more personalized. That's Nottingham, more decent cells. So I don't want to say well, it's all like the first lot I showed you, but enough of them. I would say these are probably the untypical ones. So let me just say a bit about IPPs as I've slightly, I want to waste the time. IPPs, you know about IPPs and how it kind of worked. Abolished in 2012 when there were 6,000 IPPs in prison. And you can see what happened here to the IPP indeterminate sentences. We have this big rise after the sentences kind of introduced. And you have a lot of politicians, people who have been responsible for it, who after they stop being responsible for it say it was a really bad idea. in effect, but they didn't fix it when they were there. Very good report by HMI prisons after I left about it, talking about the increased risk of suicide and self-harm and some of the problems with the system. But making a point, I think, which is, they talk about these three categories of IPP prisons, which bears out my experience. So working up, there are some that are ready to release as soon as we can get the system geared up. There are some that are ready to release. There are some that could be released by very chaotic lifestyles if there was the right support available for them in the community. And there are some who are still really dangerous, however you assess that. And it's worth maybe trying to explore this a bit more. So at the moment, the number of IPPs has fallen by 37% since the sentence was introduced. 85 in March, 85% of those remaining are post-tariff. Going on for 1,500 are 5 or more years post-tariff. But 15% haven't yet served their minimum tariff. 574 still with a tariff for less than 2 years. Our release rate now is 46%. If you add to that the moves to open conditions, it's about 75% are getting a positive decision, which I think for those of you working with IPPs is worth kind of saying, actually, it's actually, if you get in front of a pro board, actually your chances are pretty good of making some kind of progress. But we reckon at the current rate, by 2020, there will still be 2,000 IPPs in prison. This shows what's happened to the release trend. We'll talk about it, but the release trend is improving, and that rate of release is accelerating. We think we're going to start hitting, that's because we're working through the easy cases. I think that release rate may fall as we start to hit some more difficult cases. And this is worth saying, this is what happened to life sentences after IPPs were introduced. To have this drop in the number of people getting life sentences, because some of those who would have got a life sentence, I think it's pretty clear, got an IPP, and that does create a kind of real difficulty about fixing the system, I think. And this is like worrying graph. These are recalls. These are the recall figures. Right? So one of the problems with the IPP sentence is that people are on life license, and people are getting recalled for, I think, quite questionable issues. And once they do get recalled, it's too difficult to get them out again. And I'll just talk here. This is just to finish. I'm conscious of time. This one is about just if you look at the bottom row. This is where we are, we think, with what's happened this year. So we've done about 1,938 cases. We can release directions on 46% and recommended to open on 24%. 30% were refused. So it's quite a high, the problem I don't think is the pro board's decision making when they get people in front of us. It's more complicated than that. And I'll finish just by talking about what I think are some of the policy options that can be, new ministers need to consider. So some of this, first of all, I'll just go back. So some of it clearly, there's a lot that can be done by making the system under the existing law and policy work kind of better. And we can do some of that, as I was saying earlier, by working more effectively together. Right? So it's not the case that no improvement can be made until politicians decide to do something. Actually, we can get on and are getting on with doing stuff now. But even with those improvements that we're making, it does require some policy changes to make further or more rapid progress. So you could do conversion. You could have a sunset clause where you abolished it. Or you could do something about the risk test. You could reverse the risk test. You could executively release some, particularly those who've now done longer than the current maximum tariff or sentence. You could do something with short tariff IPPs, particularly for those who've had a tariff of less than 2 years. We need to do something about recalls, I think, in particular, to try and reduce the number of recalls. And I think it's important to do something about approved premises and kind of ROTL. Part of the problem now, I think, there's lots. And I suppose when I prepared this title originally, I thought it was actually about the risk test. I thought the answer to this was, at least for some prisoners, some IPPs, reverse the risk test, perhaps for the short-term people. I don't now think that'll necessarily make that much difference. It might make some. I think the key now, much more, is about what's the community provision. So I think it is really important that we do something about enabling ROTL again, because I think that is an important way of testing people. I think it's really important that there are more approved premises places, and I think some of the capital budget that the MOJ has needs to be used for that rather than simply more prison places. And I think there is possible to do something about recalls. Right? And actually, I would say to them, let's say to New Secretary, it's on that end I would focus your attention. I think those are all doable. I think they're doable politically. And I think those are the things that will have the most impact on the IPP population. And on that note, I think I've probably gone just a bit too long, but thanks for your attention, and thank you for the welcome you've given me over the last 24 hours. Thank you.